My name is Akanksha Mehta and I'm chairing the keynote. I would like to welcome you all and let you know that this event is being recorded and shared online. There is a Facebook live stream as well. Closed captions are available and you can send questions for Professor Khalili after her talk through the Q&A function at the end of the keynote. Please note that any offensive, inappropriate, discriminatory comments or questions will result in the person being removed from the event. The chat box has been disabled and we have had to mute all participants, but do use the Q&A function at the end of the talk. Before we go on to introduce Professor Khalili, I'm going to hand over to Professor Karen Smith, who's going to say a few words. Karen?
Great, thanks very much. All right, so my name is Karen Smith and I'm the head of the International Relations Department at the LSE. And on behalf of the International Relations Department, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2020 Millennium Conference on Entanglements and Detachments in Global Politics. Millennium has been based in the IR department since its founding in 1971, which means it's almost 50 years old. The department will celebrate the centenary of the first chair in international relations at the LSE in 1924, which was created in 1924. So Millennium has been an important part of the department for almost half of the department's existence. Now, Millennium is, as you know, an entirely student-run journal, and our research students edit and manage it, while graduate and postgraduate students can participate in weekly editorial board meetings. The journal enhances the intellectual community among our PhD students, and the journal's editors and deputy editors have gone on to prestigious positions in institutions around the world. I'd like to congratulate this year's editors, Alice, Andy, and Enrique, and the Millennium Conference team for putting together such a stimulating conference program. And I'd like to note this is an especially challenging feat in the middle of a pandemic. So well done, you guys. So again, I'd just like to welcome you to the conference, and I'm now going to hand you back over to Alice, Andy, and Enrique.
All right, thank you, Karen, for your kind words, and welcome everybody to our 2020 Millennium Conference. My name is Alice Engelhardt, and on behalf of myself, Andy Lee, and Enrique, my fellow Volume 49 co-editors, it is my pleasure to warmly welcome you to this year's conference. We want to start by saying a huge thank you to all of you for being here and to everybody who's collaborated to create the conference, everybody who shared their thoughts over the past weeks and months, all of the speakers who are sharing their work, the panelists, the chairs, and everybody who's put this together, as well as the previous Millennium teams whose work this builds on, and the much wider community of thinkers that we're learning with. A special thanks to the LSE for Housing Millennium and the entire Millennium team, but an extra special thanks to the team of stewards who are working hard this week and our conference organisers, Natava Deshmukh and Eleanor Kristaki-Hendrick, without whose hard work none of this would be possible. Thank you. This year has been intense. COVID-19 exacerbated existing social and economic and political inequalities, and the year has been marked by racism, violence, and extractive politics across the world. Although this isn't the first Millennium Conference with an explicitly environmental focus, it might be the first that is itself disrupted by a more than human event. And it was a difficult choice deciding to take the conference online, knowing that it would be harder to create spaces to connect with each other. But this year, there was no avoiding either the entanglements between the human and non-human, or the violent and political entanglements that constitute our worlds, as well as the politics that exceed these, and the necessity and possibility of relating differently or detaching. And so it feels timely to be meeting now, and with over 1,000 people participating, we're very excited and grateful to be here with you this week.
There were, of course, many warning signs of our current predicament, not least the environmental calamities banalized as fixtures of daily news, but also infectious diseases. Just in the past 17 years, there have been SARS, MERS, bird flu, and swine flu. Last year, 1/4 of the world's pig population, including 300 million pigs in China, were exterminated as a deadly swine fever swept across East Asia. We're in the state of living emergency of continuous extraction, environmental degradation, and the deeply unequal, gendered, and racialized impacts of environmental catastrophes. The ongoing pandemic and its political fallouts, themselves enmeshed in long-term interrelated processes such as industrial revolution, urbanization, modern medicine, and the violent assemblages of power that accompany them, are a potent reminder that the political lives and historical trajectories of human beings are intricately entangled with their environments. Although as critical scholars, we're encouraged to cultivate intellectual sensibilities, the heed to the silent and untold aspects of world politics. However, events of the past year have perhaps shown us that there has been a lack of understanding in international study of the momentous changes unfolding around and in front of us. Faced with the messiness of connectivities and shared vulnerabilities, we think that approaching global politics through the prisms of entanglements and detachments is paramount to finding new answers. Making sense of how humans are entangled with and yet detached with the environments requires an understanding of politics, not only through the ways in which people grow, make, eat, live, and see, but also in what exists within, amongst, and around human beings, as well as how we relate to them. Acknowledging this complexity means that relationality is not just a descriptive modifier used to signify a certain sensibility or theoretical stance, but a very subject of scholarly inquiries. Needless to say, there are no easy answers, quick fixes, or one-size-fits-all revolutionary slogans.
As you can see from our program this year, a program that we're extremely proud of, thinking about entanglements and attachments connects the most pressing issues in the present day. We've organized a series of roundtables that bring to you conversations about multi-species justice and dehumanization in the colonial present, as this afternoon, about how politics is entangled across seemingly disparate spaces and temporalities, about how conceptions of the environment emerge from colonial histories and modern science, about how we can study the worlds that we live in without reproducing colonial and anthropocentric knowledges, and for our final roundtable, about the ethics of detaching from corporate extraction and devastation and connecting differently with other forms of life and matter. We would also like to encourage you to keep participating in our panel discussions, which cover important and inspiring work on the connections between unnatural disasters and anti-racist politics, the ecology of disease, justice for humans and other species, industry and resource extraction, food security and degrowth, infrastructure and architecture, vibrant matter and museums, borderlands and biometrics, creativity and resistance, and decolonial archives. Finally, it's with our greatest pleasure that we introduce to you our keynote speaker this year, Laleh Khalili. Professor Khalili's work touches upon so many entangled yet seemingly detached aspects of global politics woven together. Analyses of gender, race, political economy, maritime transportation, and the ongoing violence of colonial regimes. Thank you all for being here with us. And we now hand this over to Akanksha Mehta to further introduce Professor Khalili.
Thank you to the editors and Professor Smith. So introducing Laleh is not easy because Laleh, as many of you have encountered her, is a brilliant, wonderful human being. I asked Laleh to give me a biography, and she gave me a very short biography that I will read out, and then I'm going to add a few things from my end. Laleh Khalili is a professor of international politics at Queen Mary University of London and the author of Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, The Politics of National Commemoration, Time in the Shadows, Confinement and Counterinsurgencies, and her recent book, Sinews of War and Trade, Shipping and Capitalism in the Arabian Peninsula. So this is what Laleh sent me. And to add to this, I would like to tell you a little bit more about her work and also her teaching and other commitments to creating an academia that we all want to be in. Her work has been compelled with and curious about the workings of transnational movements, of colonial forms of power and violence, of resistance, of ideas and practices of people, and now of capital and cargo. She has woven through analysis of gender, racialization, political violence, political economy throughout her research, and has been particularly fascinated by both the ongoing violence of empire and the afterlives of colonialism in contemporary politics. Her work very interestingly and beautifully draws on archival and ethnographic methods, weaving them together. She has written the books that I've just mentioned and also written a wide range of articles on subjects from the politics of pleasure, gendered subjectivities, to trade, collective memory, the role of happiness and counterinsurgencies, and much more. Laleh is a phenomenal teacher who taught at SOAS for 15 years before Queen Mary, and her teaching has throughout drawn from her research. She has taught on political violence, gender, culture, resistance, comparative international politics of the Middle East, ethics of research, and a range of other subjects. Anyone who's had the pleasure of being in a classroom with her knows how committed she has been to teaching and what a great teacher she is. And lastly, in addition to all of this, if you've worked with, been supervised by, mentored by, or taught by Laleh Khalili, you know that she's brilliant, but also extremely generous, kind, consistent with her time, encouragement, care, energy, and critical and considerate engagement with your work, no matter at what level of your career or what level of your academic study you are at. There was no way I'm not going to mention any of this to do with Laleh as I introduced her today. So I'm really pleased to welcome Laleh Khalili for the keynote. Her talk is called Carceral Seas, and she will be speaking for about 45 minutes. You can use the Q&A function to send in your questions, and we will have a Q&A afterwards. Thank you, everyone, and welcome, Laleh.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you guys. And Akanksha, I'm in that moment of wanting to cry, but knowing that if I do, my eye makeup is going to run, so I'm not going to cry. Thank you so much for your incredibly generous introduction. I'm also incredibly grateful to the editors of Millennium, Enrique, Alice, and Andy. And I just want to say that it was a wonderful surprise to be asked to do this, and I'm incredibly honored to be able to do it. So thank you very much for asking me. It's an incredible honor. So I'm going to go on ahead and start then. In his Haunting the Sea is History, Trinidadian poet Derek Walcott tells the story of captivity at sea during the Middle Passages, and I quote his poetry. Then there were the packed cries, the shit, the moaning, exodus, bone soldered by coral to bone, mosaics mantled by the benediction of the shark's shadow. That was the Ark of the Covenant. Then came from the plucked wires of sunlight on the seafloor, the plangent harps of the Babylonian bondage, as the white cowries clustered like manacles on the drowned women. And those were the ivory bracelets of the Song of Solomon. But the ocean kept turning blank pages, looking for history. The harrowing history of captivity at sea of the Middle Passage is also the history of the emergence of capitalism in Europe and of the development of the United States in the Western Hemisphere. Historically, captivity at sea has also been used as a means of incarcerating the unwanted, usually the politically intransigent who need to be kept out of vision, hearing, and access. The British used ships as floating prisons for the American colonists during their independence struggle against London. More recently, the Home Office has floated the idea of such migrant detention brigs again. Histories of navigation in the early modern period also tell us of the forcibly recruited seafarers who worked the great sailing ships of the age of colonization at the point of a whip and under the constant threat of horrific punishment. And of course, there's a millennia-long history of slaves working in galleys of sailing ships as the brute force that powered the movement of vessels upon the deeps. So from very early on, captivity at sea has been both a means of producing value and wielding coercive power across the surface of the globe, and sometimes both at once. What could have been a contingent condition of capital accumulation, of having to transport African persons across the Atlantic to work in New World plantations, and of using carceral power as a means of punishing vast swathes of intransigent populations, both became fortuitous for the empire. The sea as a social space is not subject to the same constraints as a territorial space upon hard ground. The sea can be unreachable. Its far reaches undiscoverable. The sea's surfaces and boundaries are perpetually changing, subject to multiple and overlapping forces, regulations, and laws. It is strangely divisible in the way earth and territories are not. Sovereignty over it is difficult to define, ascertain, and defend, even with the extraordinary force of both law and navies. At the same time, coercion upon the surface of the deep is difficult to detect for the very same reasons: unreachability, invisibility, and divisibility. In this talk, I'll focus on particular forms of contemporary captivity at sea. And I want to reflect a bit on what it means to hold people captive on the sea and what sorts of work such captivity at sea does for the accumulation of capital and for notions of security and sovereignty. And in both instances, for the mutual effect of such captivity at sea on legal regimes and the reverse. Perhaps I shall begin with captivity at sea during the War on Terror. As I've written in my time in the shadows, different modalities of captivity and confinement and liberal counterinsurgencies arise out of the complex of law and administration and in reaction to nationalist protest or anti-colonial protest. Liberal counterinsurgency depends on legal regimes which pay lip service to concepts of legality, accountability, and transparency. Given the importance placed in these latter virtues, forms of confinement emerge in liberal counterinsurgencies which allow the counterinsurgent force, which is often an imperial one, to extraterritorialize captivity, precisely in order to confound calls for accountability, legal conformity, and clarity. There's a long history of island prisons, for example, as places of exile and confinement. And the British Empire in particular perfected this form with every corner of the empire having its own island prisons and penal colonies, from Andaman Islands to the Seychelles, from Tasmania to Ceylon or Sri Lanka, the latter as a place of captivity for the Boers at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. In a sense, prison ships act as a kind of floating, unmoored island, fragments of sovereign confinement floating on the surface of the sea. They're hard to reach and escape, just as island prisons are. But they have the added benefit for the imperial force that they can steam through different legal regimes. This multiplicity of legal regimes emerges out of powerful states' constant attempt at territorializing the world's seas. Whether by custom or by law, the perpetually changing surface and substance of the sea is zoned into different spaces to which different legal regimes apply. As Phil Steinberg has written in his corpus of research, these legal regimes emerged out of a sustained tension between the ideal of the ocean, I'm quoting, tension between the ideal of the ocean as a space that supports the division of the world into sovereign states and the ideal of the ocean as a free space of flows that supports commerce among them, end quote. Using this variability in the legal regimes applicable to the thalassemic regions, to the sea, the US has tried to avoid the kind of legal challenges or political demands for accountability that have arisen in response to captivity in places like Guantanamo Bay or Bagram Air Force Base or other places that the US has used as land-bound detention spaces. As it is now well understood, the US assumed Guantanamo Bay was exempt from the writ of habeas corpus because of its ambiguous territorial status. It was at once a perpetual holding of the US under an indefinite lease and not included within the boundaries of the US because it is a non-annexed colonial space. This gave the US the language it needed to first transform the base into a migrant detention center for Haitian refugees, and later as a counterinsurgency detention center. I think it's also worth noting that the detention of Haitian refugees under a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, was ostensibly a quarantine. So I think it's fascinating to think about the conditions of quarantine currently and the way that they relate to and seem to reinforce a form of containment of mobility. And the Haitian refugees who were racialized, abandoned in these horrific camps, refused entry, were also portrayed as vectors of illness, as carriers of a new plague, HIV, as alien bodies to be banished and interned. There's kind of a convergence between pandemics and racialization has a long history in modernity. A ship afloat on the sea can act in much the same way. When outside the territorial waters of the US, the applicability of habeas corpus or the other legal strictures of the US become less clear. In Europe, the ruse of quarantine is used, for example, to reject the racialized bodies of migrants afloat. This has happened very recently with a Maersk ship. So it's a Danish ship that it picked up a bunch of migrants and a bunch of different European states actually used the excuse of quarantine and COVID to refuse berthing, to refuse landing to this Maersk ship. So in Europe, the ruse of quarantine is used to reject the racialized bodies of migrants afloat. Not all becomes spaces of detention, of course. A rich tourist from the global north will be able to leave an infected ship after a few days. But for those who have no power to challenge their internment, a ship can become a space without any rights to demand the release of the body of the migrant. So for example, migrants on rickety boats will be rejected ostensibly because they may carry COVID. Seafarers also cannot leave ships that they have worked on for months after the end of their journey contract ends, and they are refused entry at ports of disembarkation. So at the moment, there are upwards of 400,000 seafarers that are on ships. After the end of their contracts, they have been on ships for somewhere up to 16 months without having ever been able to go home. So they haven't had a chance, and their contracts ended 6 or 7 months ago. And in many instances, they're not even being paid. In the early years of the War on Terror, 2 US ships, and perhaps up to 17, we don't know the exact parameters of this, were known to have acted as brigs for War on Terror prisoners. These included USS Peleliu, which held David Hicks and John Walker Lind, the Australian and American combatants respectively, and USS Bataan, which operated off the coast of Pakistan in 2001, 2002, and held other lower profile detainees. Please also note the names of the ships. USS Peleliu and USS Bataan are both the names of places where the US has had colonial interests in the Pacific in particular. But this form of captivity, War on Terror captivity on board ships, continued even under Barack Obama, where, for example, Ahmed Warsame of Somali al-Shabaab was held for several months on USS Boxer at sea in 2011, while a large number of other al-Shabaab fighters that were held on other amphibious assault ships, or they were held on USNS Lewis and Clark, another colonial name, this time continental land colonization of the continental US, which was used as a brig for Somali pirates in 2009. Of course, much like land prisons, there's a British counterinsurgency history for this too, where HMS Agenta was used in the 1920s as a brig in which, in the Irish uprising, under the civil authorities, the Special Powers Act of Northern Ireland in 1922. And again, it was used in the 1970s when HMS Maidstone was a place of internment of Irish Republicans of Northern Ireland during the Troubles. The Vietnam War, which was a watershed in the mass use of container ships, also saw the usage of containers as brigs for intransigent US soldiers in the theater of war. In his Fish story, Alan Sekula, the essayist and photographer, quotes a US general in charge of Vietnam War logistics as saying that, and I quote from the book, "The Connex container has found countless additional uses in the war theater. The metal cubes are converted into dispensaries, offices, supply rooms, and command posts," end quote. Sekula adds, open quote again, "Perhaps the innovation was yet to come, or perhaps the general saw fit not to sully his suburban metaphor, but the containers were also used to imprison mutinous and delinquent American troops at the Long Bin Stockade or jail, which was nicknamed LBJ by its inmates," end quote. Long Bin jail. While this militarization of captivity at sea is one of the most obvious instances of a state's projection of their direct power across the world, there are 3 other instances I will discuss here where securitization and captivity at sea have served in a more diffuse form to bolster capitalist accumulation in unexpected and sometimes even unintended ways. These 3 categories of events are the movement of ghost ships of migrants across the sea, the captivity of seafarers first by pirates in the Gulf of Aden, and later by COVID aboard ships. Ghost ships are ships abandoned at sea by their officers and crew. This abandonment lends itself to fiction and imagination very well. As for example, not too long ago, a few years back, a story circulated about a ghost ship full of cannibalistic rats floating off the coast of Britain. You can imagine, it's kind of a horror film imagery. Less melodramatically, very often ghost ships are abandoned by seafarers because the ship is considered by them to be unseaworthy, or even more frequently because of non-payment of wages by the ship's owners or charterers. In the last few years, one of the most contested use of ghost ships is as transport vessels for desperate migrants traversing the Mediterranean or the Aegean Sea in order to reach Europe. Perhaps the most famous are the Blue Sky M under a Moldovan flag. Note that Moldova is a landlocked place, and the Ezedin under a Sierra Leonean flag. These flags of convenience are essentially allow for minimal amounts of regulation of ships. It is not yet entirely clear whether these ships were actually abandoned by their crew or if their representation of them as abandoned vessels is part of the propagandistic discourse of European border control. Blue Sky M, carrying 970 people, was originally built in 1976 and had been decommissioned as a bulk carrier before being chartered and captained and crewed by other migrants themselves when the ship was boarded by the Italian Coast Guard in December 2014. It appears that the ship's crew and officers, themselves migrants, melted into the body of passengers once the ship was boarded by officials. Only a few days later, after Blue Sky M was boarded, Ezedin, with 360 migrants on board, was abandoned by its crew and captains and was towed to port in Italy. Ezedin had been a livestock carrier and was even older than Blue Sky M, having been constructed in 1966. Nowadays, ships are usually scrapped after about 25 years because often their metal integrity actually falls apart from having been in salty water for such a long time. So these ships had been at sea for upwards of 40 years. It is worth noting that today the average age for scrapping ships is around 25 years. So the fact that these ships were years old, 39 and 49 years old, gives an indication of how precarious their conditions must have been. In fact, photographs of the ships themselves show something of this, with rust covering all surfaces and the hulls of the ships filled with bodies so tightly packed as one does not even want to contemplate what might have happened should there be an accident, should there had been an accident. More recently, and as I just mentioned, the possibility of infection has been used as a means of rejecting migrants. Migrants, often escaping encampments with little or no health support, have attempted watery crossings both across the Mediterranean and in the English Channel. Both Malta and Italy have rejected ships full of migrants, and they've used COVID as an excuse. Britain has detained migrants on arrival, also using COVID as a bogeyman with which to appeal to their xenophobic base. The racialized body as a source of contagion and as a danger to public hygiene, of course, has a long history and annals of colonialism, racism, and slavery. What makes these ships not only a repository of hopes and desperate dreams of migrants, but also a weather vane for the fortunes of capital accumulation is the threefold context of meaning and practice, which transforms this form of desperate mobility something more than the courageous will of the wretched of the earth. The captivity at sea of these migrants firstly depends on global regimes of shipping deregulation, which the International Transport Workers Federation has called flags of convenience. In the 1920s, US ship owners who were trying to avoid regulations around labor, commercial use, and high taxes began registering their ships in Panama. The practice has expanded massively, and today certain open registries such as Liberia, Panama, and Marshall Islands flag some 40% of the world's ships. By flagging to these open registries, ship owners can avoid labor and environmental regulation, fair payment of taxes, and they can also avoid higher registration fees, which come with higher regulatory demands. It is notable that both ghost ships carrying migrants were flagged to open registries, to flags of convenience. A second characteristic of the process of the migration is the manner in which the movement of people is often facilitated and constrained through an assemblage of forces. States that prevent the entry with their laws, which are simply modalities of border coercion, public and private security organizations who prevent the entry of such migrants into Fortress Europe or the borders of North America, vigilantes that guard these borders. There have been people that have been going to the beaches here in Britain trying to stop migrants from coming in. And those who facilitate the movement of the paperless migrants are all part of this constraining and enabling assemblage. I want to briefly touch on the role of illicit or unlicensed businesses in facilitating these migrations. Here, I'm not speaking of small-scale smugglers, people that are selling sort of dinghies to the seafarer, to the migrants, but the kind of businesses that would be able to spend hundreds of thousands upfront to buy large floating rust buckets from the freighter market before they're scrapped. There's no question that these large-scale businesses that lie behind the movement of people across the land and onto unsafe ships have been generated by the laws of European or North American states, which foreclose the possibility of safe movement. Blame rests first with them. So really the blame is on these closed borders regimes that are emanating from North America and Europe. However, should we want to imagine these larger facilitators as humane instruments of mobility, it is worthwhile to remember that the work they do requires capital investment on aged and unsafe, though still expensive vessels. Some of these vessels cost certainly more than $100,000 to buy, so they're not cheap. The exploitation of labor of crew and captains beholden to the business providers by their own desperate need to escape, and rapacious rates of return on the facilitation of migration of any one migrant. In fact, the manner in which the rates charged for smuggling migrants across the sea are calculated smacks of the same global regime of racialized and geopolitically determined value extraction, which can be observed in all sorts of workplaces worldwide. Perhaps the most horrifying instance of such racialized migratory regime was observed in April 2015 on a migrant boat trying to leave from Libya to Italy with 900 migrants on board, and which sank with untold casualties. On that ship, Black Africans, as well as women and children of various groups, were locked into the dank, foul, and overcrowded hold, which sprang a leak immediately, while Syrians and other migrants who had paid more for their crossing were allowed access to the deck. When the ship sank, those in the hold were unable to escape and drowned, while those on the deck had a better chance at rescue, even though, of course, many of them also didn't survive. Being a captive in the hold would have been deadly for the African people in there, in echoes of past deaths. As Christina Sharp has written, the addition of the word human to cargo does nothing here to ameliorate the ghosting these ships do of transatlantic slavery, or the afterlives of slavery, or the afterlives of property, end quote. But perhaps the reason such racialized regimes of value extraction are allowed to persist, and why illicit businessmen can operate on the margins of Europe, is because migrants, particularly illegal ones or those that are unpapered, provide a reserve army that can be deployed for cheap employment, below minimum wage and enforceable conditions on the European continent. In 2011, Alan Sekula and Noel Birch wrote that the cargo containers are everywhere, mobile and anonymous. They are coffins of remote labor power carrying goods manufactured by invisible workers on the other side of the globe. Today, however, they are literally coffins. Sometimes these containers sometimes have migrants that end up dying in them, as we know of, for example, Vietnamese migrants that were killed in the container on the back of a truck in Norfolk a couple of years ago. Today, increasingly, production takes place in nearer factories, Foxconn outposts in Eastern Europe, for example, where wages have been suppressed. And the ships come to carry people who will work at these low-wage factories back in the centers. The centrifugal movement of capital becomes the centripetal motion of working bodies. And these working bodies are those that are most exposed to COVID also. The news we hear are of warehouses, transportation systems, care home networks, abattoirs, and meat processing factories where migrants huddled together in badly ventilated spaces, unprotected by PPE, work together for necessary wages and are exposed to COVID. Some are legal, some are not. It is a deadly cycle. People escaping from unbearable conditions to work in unbearable conditions, with the shadow of danger and death constantly haunting their escape. There's also instances where that paperlessness, their illegality, has been used as a deadly form of coercion. There's a case of Bangladeshi fruit pickers in Greece who were forced into work, not paid, and shot at when they protested against their working conditions. And this is just the most egregious instance of migrant workers being exploited. It is worth noting that the reason a country like Germany can accept hundreds of thousands of migrants and trumpet its munificence is because of the combination of its manufacturing hunger for labor and an aging population that has made it the most desirable destination for Gastarbeiters since the end of the Second World War. This perpetual capitalist hunger for labor, whether through everyday extraction of labor value in manufacturing powerhouses or through the forcible conscription of disciplined and deportable labor in commercial agriculture, is precisely why the securitization of the seas functions, whether intentionally or unintentionally, to produce a reserve army of unemployed that are deeply vulnerable to exploitation and violence. A more recent instance of captivity at sea has been that of hundreds of seafarers aboard ships unable to disembark. As ports have closed to all ships, massive cargo carriers with a few dozen seafarers, or recently emptied cruise ships with hundreds of crew members, have wandered from shore to shore, carrying workers who are often months beyond their contract and not being paid. International treaty obligations require seafarers to disembark after 11 months on board ships, but many seafarers are even today, some 6 or 7 months after the lockdown, into their 18th or 19th month aboard a ship, wandering along ghostly routes of travel, carrying goods in an economy that seems to be returning to trade and exchange. And these abandoned, forgotten seafarers have not been able to get off the ships for nearly 2 years now, have not seen their families except exceptionally via satellite internet connections, all that so the circulation of goods and capital can continue apace. Here, the violence enacted on the seafarers is of that of the borders being closed to them, of their inability to land literally anywhere, of an endless wandering at sea which can become deadly with fatigue, depression, anxiety, and a sense of abandonment. But even before COVID, another instance where the unintentional effect of such captivity at sea is the extraction of value, and the very act of captivity reveals the worldwide hierarchies of exploitation, is the confinement of seafarers by pirates, sometimes for years on end. There has been a tendency to romanticize the Somali pirates who've been climbing aboard ships, often the low-slung tankers and bulk carriers crossing the Gulf of Aden. This is not only because of the ways in which stories of pirates as anti-heroes are an indelible part of the Anglophone literature, but also because of the recognition that the foot soldiers of Somali piracy are fishermen put out of work by global conglomerates overfishing their waters, and the destruction of their countries' infrastructures and communities through civil wars that have only been exacerbated by foreign intervention by both near and far powers such as Kenya, Eritrea, and of course the US, always the US. Here it is worthy of note that the work of facilitation of migration, with its extraordinary labor hierarchies, quotidian violence, and murky destination for profit and income, piracy similarly benefits a few who are decidedly not those fishermen left behind. Piracy today is a kind of transnational business which requires negotiators, investment in fast skiffs, boats, and armament, dedicated phone lines, bank accounts that are only reached circuitously and secretly. If the fishermen do the work of climbing aboard ships and wielding violence to subordinate seafarers, the profits gained from the ransoms go to businessmen in suits, in posh cars, in new centers of capital from Nairobi to Abu Dhabi. Nor is the mythology created by Hollywood's Captain Phillips, or indeed the Danish filmmakers who made the more nuanced hijacking, has any bearing on the reality of most hijackings. When at the height of the Somali piracy, some 400 ships a year were hijacked, the vast majority of them were not European or US flagged ships with Western European or US crew and officers. The vast majority were ships owned by owners the world over, but flagged to flags of convenience, veritable rust buckets used by shipping companies that owned a handful of ships rather than the fleets characteristic of firms like Maersk, and crewed almost entirely by seafarers from places like India, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines. In many a horrifying instance, the ship's owners simply disavowed their ships, abandoning the officers and crew to their fate, with their families scrambling to assemble a ransom, often in vain. In many other instances, the ships were recovered, but the crew remained captive, sometimes for years, with a number of seafarers dying in captivity from disease and malnutrition. The negotiations happened between the suited and booted businessmen in far capitals over secure internet connections, while the working class seafarers and the exploited fishermen come pirates had to cope with dwindling hopes and inadequate food for both sides, actually. So narratives that have emerged out of the sailors, seafarers that have been rescued that say that the fishermen, the pirates, share their food and medicine with them, but there just simply wasn't enough for everybody. And this is at times where there are ransoms of millions of dollars changing hand. The other consequence of such captivity at sea has, of course, been the proliferation of a whole slew of businesses hiring out naval mercenaries to accompany ships, but also larger security firms providing insurance. Eric Prince of Blackwater fame or notoriety, for example, has established a firm of Frontier Security, which not only places armed guards aboard ships, but also engages in securing logistical support lines on land and selling insurance to cover it. So he's gone from Blackwater to providing essentially a full package for ships that particularly go to East Africa. The penetration of security firms into the insurance business is concomitant with the insurance industry's further securitization. As Luis Lobo Guerrero has written, this process entails, and I quote, market entities like the Joint War Committee of the Lloyd's Market Association becoming important actors within a global security apparatus, end quote, through setting rates, but also determining the meaning and extent of a conflict that can be considered part of this larger or can be covered by this larger umbrella of security provided by insurance companies. They define what counts as war and what doesn't, what counts as conflict and what doesn't. This co-imbrication of capital accumulation and securitization is, of course, not a new phenomenon, as scholarly works on the corporate sovereignty of such firms as the East India Company has shown. And that the process of extraction of resources requires simultaneous deployment of violence and extractive force. Perhaps it is a sign of our liberal era that such concomitant processes include captivity at sea as part of the context of our contemporary condition. We already know, because of the extraordinary work of abolitionist scholars and historians of policing, that policing emerged and was consolidated in many parts of the world as part of a colonial process which applied coercion to racialized bodies afar and later at home. This racialization of policing served not only the function of disciplining populations, but also guaranteeing circulation. In his Security, Territory, Population, Michel Foucault had written that the last object of police is circulation, the circulation of goods, of the products of men's activity. This circulation should be understood, first of all, in the sense of the material instruments with which it must be provided. Thus, police will be concerned with the condition and development of roads, with the navigability of rivers and canals. So the space of circulation is a privileged object for police. But circulation, by circulation, we should also understand not only this material network that allows the circulation of goods and possibly of men, but also the circulation itself. That is to say, the set of regulations, constraints, and limits, or the facilities and encouragements that would allow the circulation of men and things in the kingdom, I'm still reading Foucault, and possibly beyond its borders. From this stems those police regulations, some of which seek to suppress vagrancy, others to facilitate the circulation of goods in this or that direction, and others that want to prevent qualified workers from leaving their place of work, or especially the kingdom. After health and the object of bare necessity, after the population itself, this whole field of circulation will become the object of police. So essentially, he points to the ways in which policing is a means of circulation, not only for capital and goods, but also public health is often used as an alibi for policing. The ways in which the violence of policing seems to be bound up with circulation, which brings with it not only the materiality of capital accumulation, but also racialized hierarchies, and the violence of law and regulation has been the subject of this essay, of this talk. Even where countervailing forces of pirates and migration facilitators have challenged the policing of circulation, the unintended consequence has been an expansion of policing. This expansion has exceeded even the imperial force of US sea power. In the aftermath of the Cold War, when war, mass exodus, environmental disasters had become the ordinary context of politics, Alan Sekula reflected on Alfred T. Mahan's 19th century imperialist discussion of sea power and how military control follows upon trade for its furtherance and protection. Sekula then added, the sea is money. The imperial bluntness of Mahan's economism is worth recalling in an age in which Cold War ideological justifications for gigantic naval fleets no longer hold, and maritime conflicts are more likely to be nakedly, that is overtly rather than covertly, economic in character. Although the US still has the most powerful navy in the world, the rules and regulatory apparatuses established by the US and the Washington Consensus determine the shape of trade, commerce, and territorialization of the sea even more powerfully, even despite Trump dismantling some of the very liberal institutions that have shored up US empire for so many decades. Further, the locations of capital, accumulation of capital have spread to other shores. This universalized and racialized process of capital accumulation and extraction of value is now naked and overt. And captivity at sea is another less visible and unspoken instance of violence against migrants, laborers, seafarers, and pirates who are so often the victims of those who aim to control and profit from the vast deeps. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laleh. I'm going to give everyone a couple of minutes to think of questions and comments. Please use the Q&A box provided, and I will read out the questions to Laleh and she'll be able to address. So we have a comment already, but I'd like to begin with just a comment about something you wrote recently regarding the blast in Beirut and how you connected what you've just talked about, the carceral seafarer regimes, to the blast in Beirut. Could you please speak a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, it's interesting because the catastrophe in Beirut actually came together from two sets of forces. And one is obviously the incompetence and venality, and of course, the ways in which the state malfunctions in order for the benefit of those who are in power in Beirut. But the part that I wrote about was about how we actually, there was an international element about this, which had to do with the fact that a ship that was owned, that was registered, okay, so a ship that was owned by a Russian guy who had registered the ship in Bulgaria and in Cyprus, but the ship itself was flagged to Moldova, was carrying goods from Georgia, the country of Georgia, to Mozambique. And what it was carrying was apparently the ammonium nitrate used for industrial explosion. It was going to be used for mining in Mozambique. And the ship made a stop in Beirut. And when it was stopped, it apparently didn't pay the Beirut port fees. And so Lebanese port authorities boarded the ship. And when they found that, that there was a number of problems wrong with the ship, they decided to arrest the ship. In cases where ships are arrested in these instances, often the cargo is confiscated and sold, and then the money is used to either pay the wages or pay whatever the ship is owed. And in this instance, the cargo was taken off, put in a warehouse, and this actually, it took a year for that to happen. So the seafarers, there were about 10 of them on board the ship, 4 of them were able to fly home, 4 were kept there, essentially captive by the Russian owner not wanting to pay, by the Lebanese state not wanting to let these guys go. So they sat on a ship with how many thousand tons of ammonium nitrate under their feet for a year. And then after a year, some lawyers helped them get off the ship, and the ammonium nitrate was moved to a warehouse. That's where the incompetence of port officials and the state kicks in, where that ammonium nitrate sat in a warehouse with fuses and firecracker or fireworks.
And of course, then 6 years later resulted in the catastrophe. But in part, it's the whole debacle started because of flags of convenience, because of the process of offshoring of ownerships, and because of the fact that in most instances, there's very little to protect the actual seafarers, or indeed to protect, in this instance, the port from this very dangerous cargo that was aborted. So a lot of the elements that I've talked about today, particularly with this kind of the flag of convenience, which is used in many instances, was very central to the ship arriving there and for its cargo to be confiscated.
Thanks, Laleh. So I'm going to just touch upon the comment that's in the Q&A. The comment is from Javier Poveda, and it says that what Dr. Khalili explained seems to be very similar to what happened in the US during the first half of the 20th century. And the comment is about the policy of eugenics in the US and how IQ and other forms of technologies that were used to legitimate US policy against immigration. There's not really a question, it's more of a comment, but I was wondering if you could speak to these technologies, like, you know, technologies of governance like IQ and other things and how they connect to what you're talked about.
Absolutely. I mean, they're absolutely right that there are a whole series of sort of these forms of technologies of governance, of technologies of control and coercion are used in a lot of ways. So IQ was one psychological methods that's used for this. But we also have legal devices that are used. And again, flags of convenience is one legal device, but also these incredibly complex corporate registration mechanisms is another legal device that is created that ends up protecting capital accumulation. So one example that I can give is recently there was a great big leak of a lot of banking information, and this was banking data that was being sent as a kind of method of making sure that there was no money laundering, and these were reports that were sent to the US Treasury. Of course, it's quite interesting that the US Treasury is the one that is kind of controls world's banking or monitors world banking. But setting that aside, these documents were documents that were going to the US Treasury. And one of the things that came out in these documents, in these financial documents, was how incredibly lax the UK corporate registration mechanisms were. And so while the US Treasury was worried about money laundering, one of the things that has become very clear is that the Companies House here in the UK requires very little sort of proof or evidence of anything. And so, of course, you know, governments are interested in money laundering, but if you just want to evade taxes, if you belong to a kleptocratic family that wants to steal the resources of a country in which you have a stake, or if you want to do exploitation of your workers in any location without having to worry too much about regulation or control, you set up these corporations in a kind of a Companies House setup, which requires so little scrutiny, which does not have very much scrutiny. And I think that that's another device that is used. And then there's all sorts of other stuff. So for example, international registries will allow for, and everybody can have a domestic registry and an international registry for shipping, allow for payment of lower wages that are, you know, and hiring of non-union workers. And so there's lots of different devices that are used as modalities of governance. They tend, within shipping, they tend not to be this kind of a personalized method that we see in, for example, IQ. They tend to be much larger and have to do with corporate instances, but there's certainly mechanisms that even at their base, they were not necessarily intending to be racialized. They are entirely facilitated by the racialization of labor globally.
Thanks, Laleh. While we're waiting for more questions to come in, I have a couple of more questions. Okay, we have a question from Shari. Let's go to that first. I can always come back to mine. So Shari Plonsky says, Laleh, thank you so much for your gorgeous talk tonight. I'm still grappling with everything I've learned. I was wondering if you could speak to how the logics of the sea operate, on one hand as a kind of exceptional disconnected space, but then further leaches out and intersects with the ground, how the way certain bodies are captured in sea then reshapes and is reshaped by their relationship with the places they encounter, the ports, the borders, the landed sites that seem so separate from the sea.
That's a really brilliant question. So let me talk about how the sea is exceptional and disconnected, and then what happens at the encounter with the shore. Precisely because the sea is more unreachable, more difficult to get, more invisible, more, in fact, very difficult to monitor in any sense. This becomes a space in which, on the one hand, those who have the most coercive force, those who have the navies that can cover the longest distances, those who have presences along the shipping lanes, will have some ability to see what is going on more than others. But on the other hand, by and large, the seas, the oceans are vast. And so the degree of control is constrained often by proximity to land. So, and sea lanes do tend to, except for across the Pacific, they do tend to run close to coasts in most instances. But in coming to encounter the land, you end up transforming many different elements. And so, for example, that invisibility becomes visible. The ship that was in the middle of the sea and nobody could monitor upon arriving in the port could be potentially inspected. Its workers, its seafarers could disembark from the ship. It does pick up goods. It often is subject to customs regimes, for example, or inspections. And so that moment, something changes in that kind of element of invisibility. But even there, of course, power operates very differently, or allows certain actors to operate very differently than others. So that if you are a much more powerful, much richer ship owning company, you have access to certain resources that others don't. Or if you are, in many instances, if you are, for example, the United States, you can have a presence in many ports which others don't. The last year that I was at SOAS, I had a wonderful undergraduate student who did this amazing undergraduate dissertation research from which I learned a huge amount. And what it was about was precisely about this, that the US has loads of Coast Guard attaches appointed to the biggest ports in the world. So for the US, the Coast Guard, US's coast expands into other coasts. So Hamburg, for example, has a Coast Guard attaché, a US Coast Guard attaché, Port of Hamburg does, Abu Dhabi does probably, and some of these other ports do. And so to me, that was also interesting, because that means that when it comes to the port, not everybody is treated the same. Of course, the US Coast Guard can dictate, and in fact, the US can dictate what sort of inspections a ship can be subjected to, who can get off the ship and who can't, what sorts of regimes of access a port has and doesn't. And so to me, that encounter at the port becomes much more determined by power, although of course at sea, again, those who have the biggest ships and the biggest cannons are also the most powerful.
Thanks, Laleh. There's a group question from Alex Toffel, Ida Berkwad, Rasha Sabha, and Shika. It's really nice to get a group question. Thank you so much for this incredibly rich talk. We wondered if you could share more reflections from your own ethnographic work, traveling on tankers, and how it informed your talk tonight.
Thank you so much for that brilliant question. And I know some of you guys, so that's lovely. I didn't go on a tanker. I wish I could. I really wanted to go on a tanker, but tankers are very difficult to get on because of liability questions, because often they're carrying stuff that is very flammable. And so that it tends to be more difficult to get insurance to be able to go on board a tanker. I went on container ships. I went twice. And the trips were amazing on many different levels. There was a personal level, which is that you're completely cut off. As a passenger on the ship, I didn't have access to satellite connection. So essentially I didn't have access to internet unless I came into port. And it was amazing how this kind of a silence, enforced silence, actually allows you to think and to read and to write in ways that I have forgotten. I can't say others have forgotten, but I definitely have forgotten that kind of swathes of time where you have to entertain yourself and you can't go on your gadget. So that was amazing. But those were at personal level. The other bits of it that were amazing ethnographically were twofold. One was because of the relationship that one establishes when you're in this kind of what a Norwegian sociologist in the 1950s called a total institution. You are in a total institution in part because you live and work, you dine, your leisure time, everything is with the same group of people, and you're pretty much stuck on inside this institution and you can't leave. So it is a total institution. And so as a passenger, I also developed relationships with a lot of the seafarers. Of course, because I was a passenger, a paying passenger, that made a difference also. So I had, for example, I was invited to sit at the table of the captains, I was at the captain and officers, rather than with the crew. The crew's dining hall was in a separate space. And in fact, when I asked if I could eat the food that the crew, who were Filipino, ate, rather than the food that the officers ate, the officers were mostly Croatian. And so the food that was being served to them was meat and 2 veg. Whereas I could see that the crew in the dining hall were eating Filipino curries, adobos, and it was amazing. And so I asked for that. And interestingly, they told me, well, do you really want to? Because the curries that we've made is made with the leftover meats from yesterday's officers' meals. And so you have this sense of a hierarchy on board a ship. Ships have always been very hierarchical spaces. Captains are essentially the sovereigns of their ships. So that was that, and then you develop these relationships with everybody, because you can talk to them, and as a passenger, you have the ability to speak with them, and that was quite amazing, because you have these long periods where they're bored, and you're on, and they have to look out to sea, but they can talk as much as they want to, and so you end up having these long conversations, which were quite revealing, not only because of you find out a lot about them, you find out about their life, you find out about their working conditions, but also the ones that have been doing this work for 20-30 years will also tell you about different ports and give you a sense of the transformation of shipping of these ports over the course of 20-30 years. But also what was interesting was that, of course, you then experience also arriving into ports and leaving from ports, and that experience was amazing. So I couldn't go to Saudi Arabia for a variety of reasons. But I managed to arrive in Jeddah and stay in the port of Jeddah for 24 hours on board a ship. And so, because our ship stopped in Jeddah on its way from Malta to Dubai. And I think that experience was extraordinary, because then you see the working of the ports from the inside, which was absolutely necessary in order for me to be able to talk about this. So you get a sense of the shipping from talking, and you get a sense of the ports from these arrivals. Highly recommended if you can get funding to fund it, because it's not cheap, but it's absolutely brilliant. And it is one of the most amazing ethnographic sort of trips I've ever had the pleasure of doing.
Thanks, Laleh, for sharing that. I think you also have the blog where you were documenting your travels and the work that you were doing on the ship.
I did. I couldn't post everything on the day, but I wrote entries every day. And so everything is on my blog, which is thegamming.org. Gamming is a word from Moby Dick, and it's when 2 ships come together in the sea and sort of everybody meets and talks together on the sea. So that's called the gamming. If
we have time, we'll come to your question. I'll come to a question about Moby Dick for you, because I know that has been really influential. There's a question from Angela Smith. Thank you, Laleh, for the fascinating talk. In Melbourne in July, the state government imposed a highly racialized, harsh lockdown on 9 public housing towers, home to 3,000 people, many from migrant backgrounds. To justify this, the chief medical officer referred to the towers as vertical cruise ships. I'm wondering if you could speak to the different regimes, legal, regulatory, racial, corporate, metaphoric, that separate cruise ships from seafaring ships in terms of people being able to disembark while others cannot.
That's absolutely a brilliant question. So in both cruise ships and cargo ships, the seafarers could not disembark. So who got off the cruise ships were the passengers, and often the passengers of these mega cruise ships tend to be from the global north, or at least from the richer countries. So some of the ones that arrived in Japan were Japanese. But what is interesting is that actually, in many instances, the passengers are allowed, not in many instances, in all instances since COVID has happened, passengers are allowed, regardless of whether or not they have sick people or not. Eventually, they can get off the ship. This also happened in Sydney, and in fact, one of the ships that landed in Sydney, 400 people got off of it, 70 seem to have had COVID, and that actually spread COVID in Sydney. And of course, the government of New South Wales, I think, is going to try and prosecute the cruise ship owning company. But in that entire narrative, the thing that was lost was that in that cruise ship that let off all of those passengers had hundreds
of seafarers actually trapped on the cruise ship itself. And in fact, a number of those seafarers ended up becoming sick. And in 11 instances, I think they had to be helicoptered off to a hospital because their condition was so bad. This has happened again and again and again with all the cruise ships. And the camera and the news media, you know, film it. They're interested in the stories of the travelers on the cruise ship, and they'll tell you these kind of terrible stories about what happened to them. And in a couple of cruise ships, 4 people actually died from COVID, passengers died from COVID. And so there's these kinds of horror stories that once the passengers get off, as I said, passengers that are often rich and from the global north, then the news media are no longer interested. And so yes, there were at least hundreds, thousands of cruise ship workers that were also trapped, and they had to be eventually let off little by little in ports, which would allow them to disembark. With cargo ships, that's even worse, because most of the cargo ships in the world are not necessarily owned by European or even Chinese firms. They're owned by everybody and by lots of different owners. And so when they arrive in port, there's probably a lot more difficult conditions under which they can disembark, that they can allow their seafarers off. And so what you see is the 400,000 seafarers that I mentioned, the vast majority of them are now on cargo ships, and they are going from port to port, and everybody's constantly saying, well, we need to do something about this, but nothing is being done about it. And so what is happening is that they try to arrive in ports which often have quarantine conditions, or they have slightly relaxed their rules for coming in, but all of that is also completely uncertain. So I'm on a bunch of seafarer Facebook groups, and it's some of the most heart-wrenching stuff, because they're constantly writing to each other and saying, is Singapore port open yet? Is whatever port open yet? Because they're about to arrive into a port, and they're trying to see if they can get off, and often they can't. And so what you see, and of course these seafarers, the vast majority of them are from Philippines, China, India, Sri Lanka, as I mentioned. These are the 4 largest, and Russia. And so you find that these seafarers are from these places which cannot disembark anywhere, and obviously there's not a whole lot of attention being paid to their plight. So that racialization definitely applies in this incredibly horrific way to the people who are working these ships.
Thanks, Laleh. The next question is from Martina Tazioli, and it's also a question that I was thinking about, so I'll combine my question with this. It's on abolition. So Martina writes, an abolitionist perspective helps in challenging migrants' captivity beyond distinction between deserving and undeserving migrants, that is, in dismantling the very logics of racialized containment and kidnapping. Applying the abolitionist grid to captivity at sea seems a particularly interesting grid, as you suggested, for critiquing EU's migrant containment at sea in the name of protecting migrants against smugglers, as the EU justified operations like EU NAV4 Med Sophia. So, and I was also wondering, you talk in your paper about how you're referring to the work of abolitionist scholars in understanding the context in which policing emerged and how policing was part of a colonial process of racialization and coercion. And I was wondering now, how might we use your work to then further an abolitionist praxis, and how might we consider carceral seas and captivity of seafarers and regimes of controlling and containing seafarers in the kind of abolitionist politics that we are talking about right now, with defunding the police and dismantling institutions? So
I think what Martina's mentioning at the beginning of their comment is absolutely spot on. It's precisely that the distinction between deserving and undeserving migrants, and for that reason, that means legal and illegal, papered and unpapered migrants. That distinction has to be abolished, because in fact, once the migrants arrive on land, the degree of exploitation tends to be extensive, often even if they are papered. So when for example, a lot of the COVID cases that we see in the abattoirs in Germany in particular were legal migrants from Romania. Whereas some of the other instances that we hear about, turns out that many of the migrants that ended up getting COVID, but also were subjected to various other kinds of regimes, were illegal. That regime of legality and illegality is a system that is produced by this kind of regime of policing and control, by a force like EU NAV4 and the private firms that do its work for it, or the and the various, obviously, naval forces, not just EU, but also the specific countries, coast guards and naval forces that do that regime of policing. So as I really wanted to point to the fact that the blame lies first and foremost with these closed border, with these regimes of control, which create a distinction between legal and illegal and push the illegal workers into these kinds of incredibly difficult and dangerous circumstances. And they also produce a kind of an illicit economy, which in most instances is one that is only illicit because the border regime has made some people legal and illegal. And it's, you know, it's selling a dinghy, selling a little air raft to somebody shouldn't be illegal. But I think what I wanted to point out was that also in this process of creation of an illicit, economy around movement of people and around facilitation of mobility, there's also, even in this regime that is facilitating a kind of a project at the end of which you have migrants moving regardless of legality and illegality, even that illicit regime has its own racialized hierarchies within it. And the moment that you have some injection of capital, and the moment that you have a process of producing an economy, a self-reproducing economy, you end up getting these forms of racialization that benefit some people and doesn't benefit others. It creates hierarchies that are horrifyingly also racialized. So I think that that's what I was trying to point to.
Thanks, Laleh. There's a question from Joe and Chris. And they say in capital letters, thank you so much, Prof. Khalili. So I would like to start with that here. We are really interested in the idea of extraterritorializing captivity and the work of the ocean here. In Joe's work, Joe is looking at how international criminal law regimes work to deterritorialize their liberal centers through cosmopolitan logics, which don't name themselves, and deterritorialize their colonial subjects through the same. She says, I think it's really interesting how The Hague is less of a place than a form of justice, and it's quietly framed as a return to the greatness of the ocean. Its prison has a view of the sea. What work do you think the ocean itself, or its attempted appropriation and extraction, does in terms of extraterritorializing captivity? And she thanks you again.
Wow, that's an incredible question. I would say I would start with the great Dutch jurist, on whom not only the idea of freedom of the seas, which was from the very first the freedom of certain imperial forces to navigate the seas, but also the idea of international human rights depends. And that's, of course, Hugo Grotius, because it was in the context of colonization of the Indian Ocean that the Dutch came up with these ideas, which created a legal apparatus which underwrote Dutch imperial power there. And among this was the idea of the international, in fact, the international space is a space of law, but also everything else that had to do with the freedom of the seas, with navigation, because of course the Dutch were a naval empire, a maritime empire. And so I think that it begins in that moment. In terms of what the ocean itself does, I think the ocean is acted upon in these particular ways, precisely because it has been in the modern era since about the 14th and 15th century. Actually, I should push it back to the Crusades. From that moment onwards, the ocean or the sea has always been a space of contestation between European powers and a space of projection. And that space of contestation and projection has always had both force and the law alongside it. Now, the law might have started as a set of religious edicts and papal bulls and whatnot, but it eventually does become a kind of a secular set of international laws, which is often the servant of power. So I think the ocean acts as a kind of a milieu for that, as a kind of a material for that. The ocean itself does not do that. So I think that that's where I would probably put that. But I'd love to talk to you more about that, because I think that's a brilliant question.
Thanks, Laleh. The next question is from Alexandra Spalinska. Thank you so much for the great lecture. I have a question related to the issue of remote islands that you mentioned in the context of imperial power over the sea. Would you agree with the statement that actually even today, such islands are forgotten politically and even socially? Given the living conditions there, one could say that people should be taken back to other lands, for example, settlers. So just a question about that, about the remote islands that you mentioned, and if you could comment a little bit more about the condition or the way the remote islands are situated in.
I don't know enough about the politics of those remote islands. And I think forcible resettlement sounds pretty horrifying, especially if these are generations of people that have settled into a place. I really won't be able to say enough about it because I don't know about this. But I would also say that the idea of remoteness is something that is often used in the context of colonial power. At some of these places that are considered to be remote were a very significant part of sort of the imperial chain of islands that the US, the Britain used, for example, for projection of power across the seas. St. Helena wasn't necessarily considered remote because it was a coaling station for a while. It was at least one of the places where the British ships on the way to the empire stopped for victualling. It is only now remote or considered remote because those colonial or imperial routes have shifted. So I would kind of worry. First of all, I would be worried about sort of making edicts about whether people should be unsettled and forcibly removed. But also I would say that the idea of remoteness and nearness, the idea of proximity, is really, these kinds of geographic concepts tend to function in very political contexts. So they're not entirely neutral. But as I said, I also don't know enough about Santa Helena or Southern Georgia to be able to comment on those.
Yeah, I think that's a really crucial point about using terminology like remote or what it means. And I think your earlier discussion about the relationship between sea and land through Shari's question also teaches us how we can unsettle this idea of remote. There are two more questions, and I think we might have room for another one if someone wants to put in a question. We have to end in about 10 minutes, but there might still be room. So the first question is from Catherine, which is talking about the sea as a space to hide from the law, which, as we also know, is a very popular culture-based idea of the sea as this place where the law doesn't operate. And Catherine is wondering if you could reflect on this in terms of actions of certain actors or industries that exploit this aspect of the law.
I mean, it's quite interesting because, of course, there are a lot of industries that think that they are, hiding from the law. There are a number of people who've done some really fantastic work, for example, on pretty horrendous fishery industries on ships at sea. So ships that go out to sea, factory ships that go out to sea, often with conscripted labor on board these ships. So they're, in particular, Thai companies that conscript people from Myanmar, pay them little or no wages. If they complain, actually shoot them, kill them, and throw them in the sea. And these ships are factory fishing ships. So they fish, they process, they freeze the fish all on board. And these ships stay out to sea sometimes 6 months, 8 months at a time, really horrendous conditions, right? So you would think that this would be regulated. The point is that almost anything can be regulated at sea. There is nothing outside the purview of the law. It's just that is there the capability and the capacity to do so, but more importantly, is their will to do so. And of course, the exploitation of Myanmarese or Burmese workers aboard a Thai ship is not going to move any great power to go and police this. Whereas if a Maersk ship with a US crew gets stopped and something happens to it, that is going to get the intervention of the US brought down on the heads of these people who've done things outside the law. This happens also with piracy. And I think one of the things that I pointed to was that when a US or European flagship with US or European crew is subjected to piracy, the force of the law and violence of the law is brought down on the pirates with unbelievable force and immediacy. Whereas actually the vast majority of the people who were the victims of the pirates were not European or US flagships, nor European or US seafarers. They were often from Africa, Asia, and sometimes Latin America, much less Latin America. And very often the seafarers that ended up dying in captivity were actually more often than not South Asian or East African. And so I think the law, much like on land, is applied differentially and in ways that are deeply racialized.
Thanks, Laleh. And what could possibly be the last question is from Rahul Rao, and he's calling it the Moby Dick question. To what extent might your incredible insights about incarceration at sea be extended to think about the incarceration of animals in the sea? He says he's thinking about the cetacean entanglements in fishing nets, and conversely, the phenomenology of detachment that allows us fish eaters to not think about this too much. He also says, sorry if this is a bit of a stretch from the main topic, and he learned a lot from you and your talk.
It's a great question, in part because I think, so as somebody who's a carnivore and a fish eater, I'll say this, that if you know where your food is coming from, you're a lot more cautious about what kind of food you eat. And I think in a lot of ways, we have forgotten where our food comes from. The kind of fish that you buy in the grocery store that comes in a plastic wrap does not even have its skin often on it. Never mind, you know, seeing the entrails and the innards and where it comes from. And certainly with whales and also with actually with any kind of accidental catch in these instances, you know, it happens because of this kind of a voracious need that we have for eating what comes from the sea. So how does this apply to in terms of carcerality? I think that many of, okay, so here's what I would say as far as I know about this. I think that even when it comes to eating the fish, those states, those peoples, those businesses that wield power and capital tend to have much better access to this kind of, or much better access and much more of a will to engage in sort of the captivity and killing of whales, of fish that we use for eating, of crustaceans that we use for eating, but are also used for other things. And I think that, again, that kind of first of all, we also know that a state like Japan, for example, often, Japan and I think Norway, sometimes, and Iceland, sorry, not Norway, actually often act against treaties that they have signed when they go and engage in whaling. These are powerful states that can do so, whereas, for example, the Somalis will not find it as easily to go fishing in their own waters because their waters have been fished out by these big fisheries. So that kind of a power asymmetry, the asymmetry of capital, that all of that is also in operation there. But there is also a kind of an interspecies question here that I think you're asking. And I think and Moby Dick is actually quite a good platform for asking that, because in fact, what is really amazing about Moby Dick, and I think something that we have lost in the ways in which we consume the bounty of the sea, is that reading Moby Dick, it becomes incredibly clear that the seafarers, the whalers that were engaged in whaling, knew what they were doing, and they had a respect for the for that thing that they were consuming and killing. And in fact, I think there must be something in the story that, I'm sure I'm not spoiling it for anybody, but the story ends with Moby Dick winning and destroying and killing all the humans aboard that whaling ship, which says something about where Melville's interests and sympathies lay. And I think we have moved away from that. I think that Melville saw that as a kind of a natural outcome of Ahab's protean, crazy, kind of violent desire to control the world. And I think that Melville saw justice in Moby Dick destroying Pequod, the ship that Ahab captained. I think we have moved away from that. And I'll just end it with that. I'll just end it with Melville's ending of Moby Dick.
Yeah, I think that's a really good note to end on, because Melville has been so crucial to the shaping of how you've thought about this project, how you came to this project. And I remember you talking about Melville much before you actually started this project as well.
Absolutely.
So thank you to everybody.
From CLR James. So there is actually, he's been recommended by a brilliant, brilliant thinker as well. So.
Thanks, Laleh. And I would like to thank everyone who has asked questions, who's responded, who's heard you, who's been in that room, who's going to take away the things that you've said and come back with more thoughts and questions at another time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us from different time zones, different places. And thank you, of course, to Professor Laleh Khalili for sharing that paper, for answering the questions with so much kindness and so much depth. I would like to hand back to the editors if they would like to come in, and then we can close the session.
And I'll just say thank you very much again to the editors and also to the wonderful audience. I see colleagues and friends and former students in the list of attendees, and I just want to send you guys all love.
Thanks, Laleh.
Thank you.
So, yes.
So just to say thank you so much for a talk that I think blew all of our minds. It was wonderful to finish with the Moby Dick question. We feel like we came full circle. And we're really honoured and appreciate having opened the conference like this. Thank you.
Honour is all mine. Thank you so much, Alice. Thank you so much, Enrique and Andy.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
And Akanksha, lots of love.
Yeah, thank you so much, Akanksha.